Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Eleanor, and I have continued since last week reading Lucretius's book-length poem on the nature of things. I can hardly believe it myself, but I am immersed in it. But as immersed as you can be in any book of poetry. Now, I'll explain this. But first, I want to tell you what happened after I left off last week. So, at first, I thought I cannot possibly read Lucretius now. It's just too much pressure. Lucretius cannot withstand the pressure, the anticipation that I feel for his work. But I was wrong. He can, and surprisingly, he's actually a great sport, Lucretius. He's my buddy now. Let me explain. So I already have a book, a translation of On the Nature of Things, and it is this one. It is my grandfather's. And this was one of the reasons why I've always had Lucretius in the back of my mind and staring at me from the shelf, because I thought, I need to get to it. It's translated by William Ellery Loenard. Now I looked him up, and his translation actually goes back to 1916. And boy, did I feel it. I tried to read the first couple of pages, and I was displeased. I'm not the most patient of readers. I need to be enticed, especially at the beginning of a book. And I wasn't feeling it. And I'll put up a photo of the first page. And I'll explain exactly a few of the things that I had a problem with. So it starts, book one, Proem, which is a prologue as a poem. But the whole book it's a book-length poem in 6 parts, I think, 6 or 7 parts. Anyway, Mother of Rome, delight of gods and men, dear Venus, that beneath the gliding stars makest to teem the many-voyaged main and fruitful lands, for all of living things through thee alone are evermore conceived, through thee are risen to visit the great sun. Before thee, goddess, and thy coming on, flee stormy wind and massy cloud away, etc. I had no idea what I was reading. I was annoyed by the antique language, makest to teem, through thee alone, through thee arisen. It felt stilted to me. Now, I very much thought that my reaction was a problem with me. I'm not used to reading works like this. I'm not educated enough. I don't have enough experience. Perhaps I should have taken a course. Why didn't I study this at university? Ridiculous. So then I did a bit of research, and I found that, the most obvious choice, had I not had this William Ellery Loenard translation, would have been to go to the Penguin Classics. And that would be the A.E. Stallings translation. This came out in 2007. I am very familiar with A.E. Stallings. She is an American poet who has been living in Greece for many years. She's a formalist. She writes in traditional forms. And she has also been elected to the Oxford Professor of Poetry. Every 4 years, they elect an Oxford poet, and the Oxford poet is someone very learned who gives many lectures and teaches, etc. She is not my kind of poet, although she should be in a way, and I'm still on the fence in many ways. I love formalism, what might be called new formalism, but I'm not really sure if I'm using that phrase correctly. As you may know if you've watched my previous videos, I'm a prosody geek. I have my favorite prosody books are always just above me on a shelf. I like to read them in my free time. I'm a true geek. It relaxes me to learn about prosody, and it's an ongoing learning experience. I'm also a huge fan of rhyme. She's incredible at form, and her rhyming is unbelievable. But her poems, I feel, to my taste, somewhat too obvious. They don't mine the depths of language that I like in my poetry. But I have her book, her collected book. Selected poems. This Afterlife, which came out by Carcanet Poetry, and her latest poetry book was called Like, which I also bought before I bought this. So that being said, and so I feel like I sort of know her. I should say also that she is a scholar of the ancient classics, absolute scholar. So you're in very, very good hands with A.E. Stallings. So I started reading, and I took a photo of the first page. I got it as a sample on my e-reader, and within the first 2 minutes of reading, I purchased the book. It's incredibly fun, and it's a page turner. Let me show you what I mean. So this is the same as what I read before. Life-stirring Venus, mother of Aeneas and of Rome, pleasure of men and gods, you make all things beneath the dome of sliding constellations teem. You throng the fruited earth and the ship-freighted sea. For every species comes to birth conceived through you, and rises forth and gazes on the light. The winds flee from you, goddess. Your arrival puts to flight the clouds of heaven. For you, the crafty earth contrives sweet flowers. For you, the oceans laugh. The skies grow peaceful after showers. Well, I could read this. So what is she doing there? What was W.E. Loenard doing in his book? So what he was doing, and what I believe the traditional way of translating Lucretius is, to put it to keep it in poetic form. I mean, there are some translations in prose, but I definitely don't approve of that. It is definitely a poem. I don't approve of that. Who even am I? I don't approve of a translation. Okay, I take that back. It's not for me. I like to read poetry if it's poetry. In any case. Okay. I've become very confident in the last couple of weeks. I don't know. Take everything I say with a grain of salt. Beware. Okay. William Ellery Loenard wrote his translation in blank verse. All that means is that he counted 5 beats for every line, and it's not rhyming. And those 5 beats are usually iambic pentameter. I am meaning da-dum, 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 da-dum. Which is now completely different from what A. Stallings is doing. She's doing what I have now discovered poetry people call fourteeners, rhyming fourteeners, which I love. I love the phrase rhymed fourteeners. It basically means that she's got 7 beats to each line, and she writes in couplets, so each couplet has 14 beats, and the rhyme is, from what I can tell from my brief reading of her translation, pretty much exact. Let's just stop and be astonished for a moment that she was able to do this. When she writes in her short foreword to the translation, when she writes about it, she says that she sort of like couldn't, she thought about the fourteeners, that they would be a good way to stick to a rhythm, and she felt comfortable with it. I should say that I've also learned that Lucretius, and this is important because you want to know about the rhythm and the sound of the original poem. Lucretius wrote in the traditional meter of the epic poetry of that time, as far as I know, and that was 6 beats to a line, and it was dactylic rhythm. Dactylic, I always remember because it's like your finger. If you look at your finger, starting from the bottom knuckle, you have one larger section up to the knuckle and then 2 shorter sections. So it's dum, da-dum, dum, da-dum, dum, da-dum. So that's the original, and it doesn't work in English. It works in Latin, doesn't work in English. Now, there was no rhyme. Lucretius did not rhyme. But A.E. Stallings, she's a natural rhymer, and she said that she started finding that she naturally started rhyming, but it was slant rhymes, meaning they weren't exact. And at some point, someone who was working with her, I presume maybe it was the Penguin editors, but she doesn't say, said to her, do you think you could do like full-on rhyme, not slant, but true rhyme? And she was like, I don't think so, but I'll give it a go, and she did. Now, what that means is that it's very easy to read, but that also goes along with the way she's chosen her vocabulary. She's not doing that kind of antique language of thee, thou, and she also cheats a bit. And I feel that any translator who cheats a bit is my kind of translator, because if you're trying to be exact, you're missing the point of translation. You can never be exact. Now, she's a classic scholar. She's a Latin scholar. She's not going to make huge errors in her judgment. So I can anyway, relax in her hands and enjoy the moments, and she mentions them in her foreword, the moments where she might use words that aren't exactly what Lucretius may have meant, but she feels that using them connects the translation better to the original than sticking with a stilted, literal translation. Everyone is different. That's what I prefer. She also sometimes uses anachronisms. So she'll talk about a mirror when Lucretius really is talking about a shiny metal plate. They didn't have mirrors in those days, etc. Sometimes Lucretius will say something, a phrase that actually sounds almost the same as a modern quotation from a modern work. And so she'll tweak it a little bit so that we, as the contemporary readers, are given a bit of a wink. And I like that. It places Lucretius within my world. And I appreciate that because I'm reading the work of a poet from so long ago. He was probably so different from anything I can imagine, in a world that is so different from anything I've experienced. I need help. And she gave me the help. And I was just flipping through it and loving it. And then I second-guessed myself. This is too much fun. Also, Lucretius is beginning to sound a little bit comedic. It doesn't sound very serious. I thought, let me try one more translation. So I downloaded a sample of the Frank O. Copley translation from 1977. Now this I read. I'll put it up. So this is what I came across. Mother of Romans, joy of gods and men, Venus, life-giver, who under planet and star visits the ship-clad sea, the grain-clothed land always, For through you all that's born and breathes is gotten, created, brought forth to see the sun. Lady, the storms and clouds of heaven shun you, you and your advent. Earth, sweet magic maker, sends up her flowers for you. Broad oceans smile, and peace glows in the light that fills the sky. For soon as the year has bared her springtime face, and bars are down for the breeze of growth and birth, in heaven the birds first mark your passage, lady. Two things made me fall in love with this translation. The third line, visits the ship-clad sea, the grain-clothed land. The ship-clad sea, the grain-clothed land. That's gorgeous. I love that. And then the use of lady twice. Don't know what it is. I just really like that. Talking to Venus is like my lady, but it's not my lady, it's lady. Now, the thing is that as I continued reading the Frank O. Copley book, it just didn't keep my attention as much as the A.E. Stallings. So despite the fact that that first page is so utterly gorgeous, I'm afraid that Frank O. Copley is not really winning it, and so I've gone back to A.E. Stallings. One of the things that I should say that I especially love, and it's very trivial, just as the lady thing was very trivial, A.E. Stallings uses the phrase, nothing comes from nothing, which isn't exactly, I believe, how Lucretius puts it. I forget how the other translators translated it, but I have to give it to her. Nothing comes from nothing. It's very much Lucretius. It's very much his philosophy. So now, back to serious stuff, because this is Lucretius is very serious. I have continued to read the A.E. Stallings translation, and I love it, but I also come across many, many bits and pieces that make me laugh out loud and want to read them aloud to someone, because the rhyming is so fun, and also the way Lucretius views the world is it's very impressive, it's serious, but it's also highly amusing to someone who's reading in 2025, both because he's so right and he's sort of so wrong as well. He gets it right a lot, surprisingly, when he's talking about how light works, how vision works, image, atoms, noticing the world around you. There is a lot that I guess it's amusing because it's still very much how I might feel when I don't remember what I learned in science. But it also sounds like maybe what I learned in science. I don't have a science background, I think you can tell. But in any case, it also, I think, makes you see the world differently. And by that I mean I notice things more after he's spoken about them. I'll give you an example. Now, I'm jumping around. So I did try to read the first book, but then I thought I have to jump around, and I wanted to jump, and there's a reason for this. I wanted to jump to his chapter on the senses, because simultaneously to reading Lucretius, I'm also reading something else as a palette cleanser. And it's the work of an artist who discusses color a lot. And I wanted to see what he wrote about color. And generally it is interesting. And I will, in the next episode of this video, I will talk about all of that. But suffice to say that when I came across the way he discusses, I'll see if I can find it. I mean, of course I can find it, but I'll see if I can do it now. The way Lucretius, that is, he's like my friend now. You know, the way Lou writes, the way Lou writes about this. Oh, he's just wonderful. I really love him. He's a very interesting man. Okay, so I'm looking at the Senses, book 4, and I'm looking at the A.E. Stallings. And he's trying to describe how we see. He's trying to describe imagination, really. But I don't know if they had the word imagination then. I don't know if that was in their mode of thought. And it also questions, well, what do I mean when I say imagination? Oh, you have a great imagination. What does that even mean? Will people in 1,000, 2,000 years look back at us in 2025 and go, oh, look how quaint. They call it imagination. I'm sure they will, actually. But in any case, so he talks about why is it that we have objects, but we also have the image of the object in our mind. And he says at one point, there's another crucial fact I must explain, so mark my words, that there are images of things, a skin or bark, as we can call it, shed from objects, since it bears the same form and likeness of whatever thing from which it came. A skin or bark. It's almost like a kind of outline. So he's saying these are not ghosts in our imagination. These are not gods. These are not ghosts. This is something that's almost like coming off the object. In another part of the book, he talks about it as a film, which is really interesting in the context of, contemporary language, when you think about how, we call the what you get when you take a photo or a movie, film. First of all, since we see many objects give off matter right out in plain view, sometimes loosely in a scatter. So he's saying sometimes objects let matter off themselves in a scatter, sort of like when something's burning, there might be smoke, or there might be a smell. We can't see it, but there's smell. Or there might be. He says it's like calves shedding their birth sac as they're born, or the slippery serpent shrugging her castings off upon the thorn. And this is how, in this he mentions color, which is very interesting to me. He doesn't mention it a lot, but when he did, it was of interest to me. So, for clearly we see many things emit bodies galore, not just from deep inside themselves, as I have said before, but also from exteriors, for instance with their hue, as red and gold and purple awnings regularly do, when stretched over a great theatre, hung on poles and beams. Above the crowd they flap and billow, and their colour streams, staining the faces of the audience in the stands below. The stage and spectacle a flicker in their fluttering glow. He goes on to talk about how you can see things through a glass, and then he talks about reflection. And the things he says about reflection are it's very uncanny how close he is to the rules of, what did we call it in science class? The rules of light, how light waves work. That's how light waves work. But he doesn't call it light waves. He talks about it as a shedding of the object. And he even talks about how, why do you see each other, a mirror image? Why isn't it a true image? And in any case, I hope I've given you a little tidbit to maybe help you. I wish I had this help in choosing which kind of translation you might prefer. And also, generally in choosing if this is your kind of thing. Now, I'm going to take a break and review my notes because I want to talk generally about why I'm bothering to read this in the first place. I'll be right back. Okay, I've taken a few minutes to try to find my train of thought. Because I don't want it to seem, it would be a lie if I told you that I'm reading Lucretius, or at least attempting to read. Or at least attempting to read Lou, my buddy Lou, because it's a very important text and everyone should read it. I'm not into that. I'm interested because this is an ancient, long poem. And Lucretius specifically decided to write it as a poem. And he says, he does say within the poem that it's sort of like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down by writing it as a poem. But there's something else that's happening, which I have, this is not my idea. I came across this by reading a couple of the introductions. And I'll say that all of the translations have excellent introductions. What I read in one of the introductions, forget which one, Richard Jenkyns. In Richard Jenkyns' introduction, which is the one that's the Penguin Classics, he writes that it would be a completely different text if not for the form, if not for the poetic form. So it's not just a way of trying to get people's attention back in the day. It's a way, it's a mindset, it's a point of view that Lucretius wants to follow for his own thought process and to give to his reader as a gift. And what this really means is that the precision of outlook, the precision of engagement with the world around you, with yourself, with all your own senses, and the way your prejudice might veer you in different directions, and the way you can counteract that. And of course, this is philosophy, but he doesn't want to write pure philosophy because he's accessing something about the way we think of the world linguistically that is, for him in this situation, can only be accessed through the form of poetry. And this to me is what is most interesting about poetry, and this is why I'm coming to it, you see. Now, it's funny because when talking about contemporary poetry, I have often said to myself when I'm reading something, oh God, this poem is just too didactic. I can't stand didactic poetry. Blah, 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 blah. And I think I've widened my view of this completely now by reading this introduction by Richard Jenkyns, because he points out that what we call today didactic poetry is pseudo-didactic. Back in the before Lucretius's time, so let's say back in the day, let's say 300 BC, I think. I'm no history buff, so please excuse me. But back in that time, there was no distinction, as we have now, between prose and poetry. So, for example, if you wanted to write an instruction for the health of a person, or for example, I think he gives the example of instructions on what to do if a snake bites you, you would look up in this, you would find the instructions as a poem. This was expected. That is true didactic poetry. You're never going, no medical student is going to be assigned a textbook that's written in poetic form today. It's laughable. But so today we have pseudo-didactic, and that's very interesting to me. Now, Jenkyns goes on to say that what Lucretius was doing was very unusual, very hard to do, and was really only done by him and possibly Virgil following in Lucretius's footsteps. I'm speaking as if I know anything about Virgil. I do not. But bear with me, because, it's interesting. It's interesting for and of itself. Jenkyns says there's a fusion of two genres in Lucretius's work: the epic poem and the didactic poem. Okay, the epic, first of all, the lofty descriptions, but and the length, of course, but most interestingly, he says, you have the way Lucretius presents Epicurus's work, because he's following along with Epicurus's philosophy from a couple of hundred years back. The way he presents Epicurus, it's as if Epicurus is Odysseus, and he's going on this adventure. But the adventure is the adventure of the imagination from our perspective. And Jenkyns also mentions Achilles, that in a way, Epicurus is a kind of Achilles character. He's the great general going into battle. What is he conquering? Superstition. Yeah, so that's the epic side of it. The didactic side of it is obvious. Here you go. This is what, you need to educate yourselves. Follow me. And of course, the strangeness of this combination can be seen immediately in the introduction. I went through 3 translations in the previous, episode. And, you immediately think to yourself, if you've read anything about Lucretius before, you think to yourself, Venus? We're talking to Venus and asking her to be with us? I thought you didn't believe in the gods, Lucretius. What's going on? And I'll say that I read a bit about that as well. And of course, it's not that he doesn't believe in the gods. It's just that he's saying, first of all, look, if they are gods, they don't have anything to do with us, and they're just like us, and they're made of matter, and they're very far away. So, but the obsession with starting with Venus is something that's very easy to understand. If you remember, this is a poem. So in a poem, you can do anything. And so even if you're saying the gods don't matter and you should use your brain and look around you, you can still have a goddess appear in your poem. It's a poem. Anything can happen, which is right up my alley. Right up my alley. And I should say, I didn't know this, but just a bit of, I don't know if it would be considered trivia or not, but if you're familiar with Botticelli's The Birth of Venus from 1484, apparently Botticelli wrote somewhere that he was inspired to paint this painting by the beginning of Lucretius's poem on the nature of things, which is utterly intriguing. So here I am at this moment in time. I'm certain that I'm going to continue coming back to Lucretius, the A.E. probably only the A.E. Stallings translation. Every day, I think I'll probably end up reading a bit more, just out of plain wanting to enjoy it, just out of curiosity and joy, which is a great outcome and is exactly what usually happens with books of poetry that I read. And this brings me to another section of this video that in which I wanted to try to examine why reading poetry, I feel, doesn't always fit into the BookTube, the popular BookTube models that I love so much. I'll give you examples. I wrote them down because I knew I'd forget them. When you're reading prose, unless you're reading short stories, I suppose, but whether it's fiction or non-fiction, you read the book. You don't jump around. You start from the beginning. You end at the end. You can tick it off, and you can tick it off as read on your whatever, Goodreads or whatever it is. I don't know what you do. You can put it as read in your notes, and you can begin to view it as a whole. And then at the end of the month, which is what I love, I love BookTube. I read this, and I read this, and this is what I thought of this, and this is what I thought of this. It doesn't really work like that for me with poetry. Yeah, I read a little bit of this, I read a little bit of that, but I didn't read the whole book, and I'm not really sure if I like all of this poet's work. I know I found 3 poems that I like, and maybe tomorrow I like another. I'm not sure. So that's one thing. The other thing is, which I'm still trying to get my head around, is that when you're reading fiction, you have different genres. So I enjoy reading fiction, but not all genres of fiction. I occasionally will read kind of romance or romantic comedy, something like that, but I don't gravitate towards it generally. I also am not such a fan of the classics, but then again, maybe I will be, and sometimes I'm in the mood. Sometimes I just want to read nonfiction. You can do that. Poetry, unfortunately, is considered all-encompassing. You don't talk about genres within poetry. You could, I suppose. If I sat down, I could make them up. Maybe that's why, just occurred to me, but maybe that's why if you read books about poetry, they might divide them into time periods or schools, like the New York School of Poets, or, the Romantics or something like that. But when you're looking at contemporary, like let's say you look at contemporary poetry, just as you would what's coming out in 2025, if you look at the world of long-form fiction, prose, there's so many different genres. And for poetry, it's like there's a bit here, there's a bit there. So it doesn't quite fit the template. I don't know if that's necessarily a problem, but it's interesting to just think about it. Yeah, it's interesting to think about it. Okay, I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to come back probably tomorrow because I have an amazing nonfiction book to talk about. Yeah. Okay, I will see you then. Thanks. Hi, I'm back. It's a day later, and I've gathered my thoughts about the other book that I've been reading this week. And it is the journal, the first volume of Anne Truitt's journals. It's called Daybook, and it came out in 1982. Anne Truitt is an American abstract artist, primarily a sculptor. She lived from 1921 to 2004. She died at the age of 83 years. Now, how did I come across this book? There's a story behind it, and I think it's necessary to tell, actually, because it's it says a lot about what I'm looking for at the moment in books. And this, I'm going to go back to Jean Valentine. So don't roll your eyes, it's okay. I promise not to talk more about Jean Valentine's poetry, but I am going back to that book by C.D. Wright that I've mentioned before. And she talks on page 18, well, she doesn't talk, she writes. C.D. Wright writes that Anne Truitt and Agnes Martin is also an abstract artist. I've spoken about her before, that they are both connected in her mind with Jean Valentine's poetry. And C.D. Wright kind of feels that you can understand Valentine's poems better if you come to her via or alongside Anne Truitt and Agnes Martin. I hadn't heard of Anne Truitt before. That's how I looked her up, and then I discovered these journals, and I thought, they had a relatively cheap offer for my ebook, where I could purchase the set of her, the trio of her journals. There is a fourth one that came out after her death, but you could purchase that for the cost of one of them. And so I downloaded all three. Today I only want to talk about Daybook, even though I'm reading them all and loving them all. But back to C.D. Wright and Jean Valentine. Just to give you an idea of what intrigued me about what C.D. Wright wrote, she said, and this is about Valentine the poet, she's not interested in working through by means of her story. Rather, she's organizing her emotions in color terms by their value. That is, by the darkness staved and the light given off. She's writing about a poet, but in terms that fit perfectly to visual artists Agnes Martin and Anne Truitt. And now that I've read and am reading Truitt's journals, it's helping me very much understand my attraction to abstract art of all kinds and how artists work with different mediums. So Anne Truitt, as I learned very quickly, because I really fell in love with her and her art very quickly, she works mostly, I'm going to be talking only about her sculptures here, mostly with wood, and they're mostly very large columns. And so she's working with simple wooden structures, and she paints them. And the colors in combination with the form in which she presents them are her unique syntax of emotions. It's something that is very easy to roll your eyes at, but is something that is true and can be seen by a lot of people. So going back to the Daybook, which is the first in her journals. The Daybook captures the years between 1974 and 1980. She was between the ages of 53 and 59 years old. She, 3 years previously, had divorced her husband, and she had 3 children at the time that she decided to start the journal. Alexandra, 19, Mary, 16, and Sam, 14. She finds herself as a single mother and a full-time working artist with the ups and downs that come with it. Her background was initially in psychology. She got a Bachelor of Arts in psychology and worked as a nurse's aide in the field of clinical psychology. And she writes in the journal that this initial work really informed her future as an artist in many ways. She also reminisces about her life as a child and talks quite a bit about her parents, which is very interesting. She doesn't come from an artistic, she doesn't come from artistic parents. It was something that was in her really from a very young age. And the most important thing about these journals that makes it so incredible to me is Anne Truitt is an absolutely brilliant writer. It is not often that you find someone who is a visual artist, a sculptor, who can write, and I'm not saying like in comparison to other sculptors, she's a great writer. She's an incredible writer, full stop. The way she's able, it's an absolute gift, and it was a shock to me when I discovered she's able to describe what is going on in her mind as an artist, how she views herself, her work, and also herself as being female in that work, and also as being a mother. She is able to interrogate her mothering as she is her artistic creations. And there is at one point a description that she gives of how she has an idea of a sculpture in her head and she makes it. And then at a certain point when she feels that, yes, this is it, she feels a surprise. She looks at the sculpture and she thinks, oh, it's you. And she said that is akin to how she felt after the birth of each of her babies. You carry this inside you and then you make it real in the world, and it's a recognition. Oh, it's you. And there are many moments in this book that I felt were so true to experiences I've had. And I'm not an artist. I am someone who enjoys abstract art, but then again, I'm not a connoisseur or anything like that, And I am very, very thankful to her. Now, the reason she's very upfront in her preface about the reason she started writing this journal. And it was because she found herself at a point in her career where she was having two retrospectives, one in the Whitney Museum of Art in New York, another in a gallery in Washington, D.C., and having to go through her art from the previous decades was exciting, but also distressing because it brought up emotions that she felt she had already worked through with her art. And she writes this quite clearly, she realized at some point that she hasn't really come to terms with the artist in her. And she felt very strongly that she needed to start writing. And the only rule she gave herself was that she had to write about her art honestly. And she does that absolutely brilliantly. I mean, I should say she was, and still is, even after her death, a major figure in American art. And I will link to her website so that you can see more of her work and learn more about her. I've written a lot of notes for myself, and it is difficult to encapsulate. I want to I want to do her justice because it is this journal, it's a great work of writing. If you're interested in how artists work, and specifically artists in her ilk, although she is unique, I do highly recommend it. And also, I know several of my viewers are interested in kind of exploring what it's like, or what may have been like in previous decades, to be a female artist. And it's very interesting and refreshing to read her take on it, because it reminds you that every woman is different, every artist is different, and many of the excerpts that I highlighted about her mothering while being an artist are interesting in the way that they veer away from the tropes that we are used to. And I will say that if you read her second and third, I'm in the middle of her third journal, which goes up to, her third one came out in 2022. No, that was the fourth one. So you have Daybook that came out in 1982. This is the one I'm specifically talking about. Then Prospect came out in 96. No, Turn came out in 1986. Prospect came out in 1996. And then posthumously, Yield came out in 2022. And Yale University Press came out with it in softback last year. And that is, the fascinating thing about this is that she's starting the journal at the age of 53 and going up to her death. And it's remarkable. There are a couple of years in Daybook that are skipped. And she mentions that she skipped from 1975 to 78 because what happened was, in 78, her first grandchild was born. And this reinvigorated her desire to journal. And it's a complex relationship she has between her very deep love and close relationship with her children and grandchildren, and then her artistic side, and then the side that, needs to make a living in the world. And none of it is cliched. All of it is fresh and fascinating and very intricately written. What else do I want to tell you about this? Another really surprising aspect of the tone of the journal is that it's very calm. It's a very calming read. Anne Truitt has this ability to deeply interrogate herself, be honest with herself, even when emotions run very high. And that is especially interesting when she talks about moments in her career in which she found herself being severely criticized. Not just bad reviews, but there is something, possibly there is still something, but definitely in the 1970s, from what she says, and I'm sure, there was a really nasty streak in some museum goers and some reviewers where they were just extraordinarily mean-spirited. And she talks about people who are unable to see her art. And she doesn't let that, she can't let that change what she does, because she's always, if she's not authentic to her own self, to her own artist, then what else is there? But it's interesting to see how she explores this idea that some people, that just because you can see, just because you have eyes, doesn't mean that you can see her work. And she even goes so far as to ponder whether, and it's a bit funny, but in a way it's interesting, to ponder whether these people who can't see her work at all have some problem with their eyes. Which is funny, but it shows you how sure she is of herself. And yeah, in comparison to the very vicious backlash she got at times. And then there's also anecdotes about her children. Her youngest child, Sam, is still coming home, from university at certain points when her older two children, her two daughters, are out in the world and doing their own thing, and they themselves are, getting married and having their children. And at one point, she has Sam help her move some very heavy sculptures. And she says to him, well, what did you think of the sculptures? And he smiles quietly and he says, actually, Mum, I've never understood what it is you're doing. And it's a revelation for her to hear that. And not in a bad way. In a good way, actually. In a way that embraces her children for who they are. And when I did a bit of research on her, I'll leave a link to this, I found a short article online written by a friend of Alexandra Truitt, who is Anne Truitt's oldest daughter. And according to Alexandra, it was only at the age of 9 that she discovered that artworks can be pictures of real things. She wasn't aware of that because she grew up around her mother's work, and the work they had on the walls of their house was all abstract art. And so it was a revelation to her. At the time, they were living for 3 years in Japan, and she came back from school one day and brought a piece of art that she had found, and with an image of a girl on it, because she was like, oh my God, you can have pictures of real people, which I thought was absolutely delightful. There's also a thread through all the journals that is so interesting to me about the artist's retreat called Yaddo this is in New York, in Saratoga Springs. It's in the middle of forests and fields, and it is a place that if you are accepted, they offer you, usually I think it's a short term, maybe a couple of weeks, where you have your own space to live and work on your art, and everything else is taken care of for you so that you can have complete silence and complete privacy. You don't have to worry about anything other than making art. And at the beginning of Daybook, Anne Truitt goes there for a couple of weeks and has the most incredible time, and then returns there, I think, at least once, if not twice. And then towards the end, in her third journal, Prospect, she is asked to be the interim president while the president of Yaddo has some time off. And so for 9 months, she helps direct. And it's very interesting to hear her reaction to finding herself in a situation where she's on the other side, where she's helping to give other artists an opportunity by taking care of all the things that they should have looked after for them. So I hope that gives you a little taste of what her journals are like. I was on such a high after reading Daybook that I immediately read turn and, prospect. And it, in a way, I wish I just stopped and taken a moment, at least a day or two after reading Daybook, because her life, it's not so much that her life changes. I mean, well, it does because she's growing older, but she's still the same person, but she does go through these changes. She changes the way she views aspects of herself, her family, and I found that a little bit more confronting for some reason than Daybook. I think because, this is a generalization, but from my first reading of these journals, it seems to me that Anne Truitt was at her happiest when she was able to work as an artist alongside being a mother, even though it was a balance and a challenge. And I'm talking about being a mother to teenagers. So, at the beginning of Daybook, the kids are 19, 16, 14. I think she was at her happiest then. Or maybe, I don't know if happiest is she was the most content, perhaps. And that is interesting in and of itself. There are so many stories of women talking about how difficult it is, and she never says it's easy, but she has a different take on it. She realizes at a certain point when she's living alone after her youngest child, Sam, moves on with his life and moves out, she realizes how much of an input being in this family, how much of an input it had on her work. It was feeding her art in many ways. I admire her so much, and I would like one day to see her art in person. In closing this video, I think it's also interesting that I happened by coincidence to read this alongside Lucretius. It seems odd, but it's not really. It's not really, because Lucretius is writing a poem about trying to really notice the world around him and understand it via the senses, and his output is a poem. And Anne Truitt is doing that in a somewhat similar way, and her output is the sculptures. And there actually is, in her younger years, when she was a younger artist, she was writing poetry, and there is a moment in the journal, in Daybook, when she says how she sort of feels bad for poets because they don't have, at the end of the day, they don't have that object that they can see and say this. It's working in language is different. And I think maybe that's why C.D. Wright, in trying to talk about the poetry of Jean Valentine, has pointed to these two visual artists. And then by reading Truitt's journal, I've come full circle in a way, because she's helped describe so well. I think what I'm trying to say is this. If you're working in the medium of language, it is going to be harder and probably impossible for you to also journal about your experience. It'll come out odd. it'll have to come out in an experimental way. And that makes me actually think of Cusk and Parade. It'll have to come out in this odd experimental way. If you're a visual artist, but you're also very good with words, there's more possibility for you to be able to describe what it is you're going through when you're doing your art. I think that's what I'm trying to say. In any case, thank you for following my my train of thought, if you have been able to. I wish you all well. I thank you for being here. And don't forget that the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye.